Okay, are we ready, Adri?
I believe we're ready. Go for it.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. My name is Aaron Thompson. I am the VR Program Director with the Utah State Office of Rehabilitation, and we appreciate you joining us here today, along with your interest in applying for one of our Pre-ETS grant applications. The purpose of this application is to assist us in our initiative to serve students who are deaf or hard of hearing, and also those who are blind and visually impaired, along with expanding our provision of work-based learning experiences for students with disabilities throughout the state of Utah. Again, we really want to provide an opportunity to provide more about this grant application process and answer any of your questions prior to providing. Before I jump in with some housekeeping items, I want to take an opportunity to introduce the staff who will be participating and providing information in this training. We have Amy Langoni, our Transition and Supported Employment Coordinator, Adri Green, our Pre-ETS Program Specialist, Ryan Prettyman, a contract analyst with the Department of Workforce Services, and Stephen Miller with our Finance Department. The next part is the housekeeping. Again, as Adri stated, all of the microphones are muted. If you wish to ask a question, you can do so by typing in the chat box. We will also answer questions during the presentation and upload them into our Q&A section on the RFGA website. Please make sure that your camera stays turned off. This will assist attendees in accessing the interpreter in order to spot them easier. We have also uploaded a copy of this presentation and a transcription in the large text box, and will be under the pre-proposal bidders meeting section if you would like to access those materials. If you don't see them on the RFGA page, you may need to refresh your screen or clear your cache in order to be able to access them. Also, please add your full name and company affiliation in the chat box so we can keep track of those in attendance. Also, a recording of this presentation will be posted on the grant page shortly. So again, we really appreciate you coming today, obtaining more information and asking questions. Amy's going to go over some of the specifics, but I'm sure as some of you are very well aware, the provision of pre-employment transition services is a key initiative for state vocational rehabilitation programs, and it allows us to meet our goal of serving students with disabilities and providing them with the services that they need to explore, identify a career path, and successfully transition from education into post-secondary opportunities and also beginning their career path. So, Amy?
Thank you, Aaron. Adri, you can advance to slide 3, please. Oh, one before that, sorry. There you go. So just some important dates to remember. Your letter of intent is due on Thursday, May 28th. So that would be a component that you need to finish if you are intending to apply for the RFGA. So make sure you do so by Thursday, May 28th. Your applications are due Friday, June 12th, 2020 at 12 p.m. or noon Mountain Standard Time. So just make sure we're cognizant of those dates moving forward if you are interested after the bidders meeting of applying for our RFGA. All right, next slide, please. So as Aaron mentioned, pre-employment transition services are mandated in our WIOA, or the Workforce Innovations and Opportunity Act. And it mandates that VR agencies provide pre-employment transition services to students with disabilities who are eligible and potentially eligible for VR services. So these contracts are helping us meet our federal mandate. Every state is providing Pre-ETS differently, but here at USOR, we are currently providing Pre-ETS in 3 ways. One, through our counselors, our VR counselors. They're providing those services in-house in their counseling sessions with their students. And then the second way is a fee-for-service through authorizations to providers that we partner with in the community. So community rehabilitation programs and then other vendors that we have in our community. And then the third way, which is why we're all here today, is through our contracts. So our contracts are helping us serve both our potentially eligible and eligible students, whereas our first two ways are mainly helping us serve our eligible students. So USOR released this RFGA to continue to contract with community partners in order to assist in meeting this mandate. So today we're going to talk through the scope of work and the other RFGA components a little bit more in detail. All right, EJ, next slide, please. Right now, USOR has 10 contracts to provide Pre-ETS services. Some of those contracts do not provide work-based learning experiences, which is why you'll notice on the RFGA materials we released Grant 2 to expand work-based learning opportunities. And then many students we were noticing who are blind and visually impaired and/or deaf and hard of hearing were not accessing our current Pre-ETS grants. So we're releasing this new RFGA to meet both of those initiatives to, one, serve our students who are blind and visually impaired and deaf and hard of hearing and help them expand on services to serve them, and then also to expand our work-based learning opportunities for all students with disabilities. All right, EJ, next slide, please. Okay, so the following organizations are encouraged to apply. Organizations who have proven experience and demonstrated outcome in providing transition services and/or Pre-ETS services. So those with experience providing services to students. Priority points will be given to organizations who provide services in rural areas. Rural, if you notice on the application cover sheet, the rural areas are in bold and underlined, so you know what we consider rural. And we determine that through the census information. So that's how we arrived at what constitutes rural versus non-rural. But as again, you'll notice on the cover sheet that those rural areas are bolded and underlined, so you can easily access those. And then also, who else is encouraged to apply would be organizations who are able to assist students in accessing STEM and art opportunities through their proposed program. So we really want to help our students access STEAM opportunities and have exploration in those different fields. And then lastly, organizations previous or currently receiving funding from DWS must be in good standing. So if you are working with the Department of Workforce Services in another capacity, you must be in good standing in order to apply. All right, EJ, next slide, please. So what must an organization or agency have to apply? First, experience serving student individuals with disabilities. Secondly, the ability to collect required data and disability documentation and enter that data timely. So as part of the contract, you will be required to enter. Since we do federal reporting, we need you to collect that data and enter it timely so that we can stay consistent with our federal reporting. So be cognizant of that as you're looking at your application. The ability to determine if the student meets requirements for the program. So AJ is going to cover what constitutes a student by our definition. So you need to be able to determine if they meet the requirements prior to their participation. You'll have to complete the pre-award risk assessment, and that's completed when we give you notice to intent to award your contract. Meet your requirements as outlined in the scope of work. We're going to cover some of the components of the scope of work today, and you'll notice it's attached to the RFGA as well. So, and then these services must be provided in the state of Utah. All right, next slide, please. So if you are a current 2018-2020 Pre-ETS contract, you may apply for these grants, this new RFGA. However, if you are awarded the new grant, we will have to terminate your current contract, and we would move forward with this new grant. All right, next slide, please. This request for grant applications is administered through the Department of Workforce Services with VR grant federal funding. So we are using our federal grant in order to fund these programs. All right, next slide. The period of performance will be September 1st of 2020 through August 31st of 2022. And then there will be an option for a 1-year renewal, which will be addressed towards the end of your second year. All right, and then I'm going to turn the time over to Adri to talk a little bit more about our population served and the scope of services.
Thank you, Amy and Erin, for getting us started. So I'm going to dig a little bit more into the details of what we will be doing and what we're hoping that our contracts will be able to help us with. So the population to be served, individuals are required to meet the definition with a student of a student with a disability as follows. They have to be between the ages of 14 to 21, enrolled in an educational institution such as any secondary education programs, post-high, non-traditional services like JJS or homeschooling. They can be participating in post-secondary programs. Those programs have to be in pursuit of some form of an academic credential, and have to be 100 hours or 1 month in time. And then they have to have a disability and be able to provide us with documentation of that disability. So what is documentation of disability in this sphere? So you all as grantees would be required to collect any documentation of disability. It would have to be uploaded into our case management system as well as kept in your own records. Acceptable documentation for disability is a copy of an IEP or a 504 plan, a Social Security award letter, any medical records from a licensed medical provider, or an approved USOR form which has been signed off by a licensed professional such as a teacher or a school counselor. So I'm going to pause there. Does anybody have any question about what constitutes a student or documentation of disability? It looks like we're pretty clear on that, so I will just move forward. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat. So as far as the program services, Pre-ETS or pre-employment transition services are activities which are designed to be pre-employment skill building, but not job development or academic achievement. So in the pursuit of this, there are 5 core services that we are expected to provide. Those are job exploration counseling, work-based learning, counseling on opportunities for enrollment in comprehensive transition or post-secondary programs, workplace readiness training, and instruction in self-advocacy. So I'm just going to briefly go over each of the 5 services and kind of tell you a little bit about them. So job exploration counseling are activities which are intended to provide the student with information about in-demand occupations, labor market information, career pathways and interests, etc. Some examples might be completing interest assessments, researching the local labor market, identifying career pathways, utilization of online resources such as ONET, Utah Futures, things like that, just to help the student to explore and understand the different worlds of work. Work-based learning is activities that are designed to be used in real-world work environments to gain skills. So some examples of work-based learning would be summer work in experiences, internships, job shadowing, temporary work opportunities, informational interviews, things like that. And then counseling on, I'm going to shorten this to counseling on post-secondary. So these are activities that are designed to help students to understand their options for enrollment and engagement in post-secondary educational training. So examples of this can be taking a campus tour, helping to research scholarship opportunities, understanding financial aid, figuring out what education is needed to succeed, and then helping students to research different fields that are available at colleges and things that they may be interested in. Workplace readiness training are activities that are designed to promote the development of job readiness, social skills, and independent living skills needed to succeed in a career. So examples of this can be financial literacy classes, social skills training, job readiness instruction, anything that helps students to build those soft skills needed to succeed in work. And then we have instruction in self-advocacy. So these are activities that are designed to assist the student in effectively communicating his or her own needs. So examples of this can be participation in leadership activities, helping a student to understand how to request accommodation, and classes on decision-making or problem solving. So as we kind of look through each of these 5 different services, that is what we'll be looking at as far as serving the students. And we do have 2 different grants, so those will look different as we work with students in each of those different areas. But does anybody have any questions about the 5 different services before I turn over to Amy to talk about our different grant options?
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit, as Adrian mentioned, about the 2 different grant options, and we're going to start going through some of the components of the scope of work as well. So as Adrian mentioned, we have 2 grant options, and you're going to want to make sure that we have different corresponding materials for each of the grant options. So there's a different application and score sheet for grant option 1 versus grant option 2. Grant option 1 is for students who are deaf and hard of hearing or blind and visually impaired. In this grant option, applicants can propose to provide 1 to 5 of the Pre-ETS services. So Adrian talked through the 5 core Pre-ETS. If you are applying for this grant option, you can propose 1 or all 5 of those Pre-ETS services. You can refer, we just gave a reference to our WINTAC, which is our Technical Assistance Center partner. They have a lot of resources on all of the 5 Pre-ETS, and I listed their web address there if you wanted to refer there for ideas. This grant option must serve students who meet the definition of a student in this population. So those that are deaf or hard of hearing and or blind or visually impaired. Applicants can propose the modality of services you wish to provide. So you could serve students in a group format or an individual format, one-on-one, school-based or community-based. So there's a little bit more flexibility and modality on this grant option. Again, applicants will apply using the grant option 1 application. So you want to look for the salmon colored materials. And then if you wish to provide work-based learning opportunities for students in this population, you don't need to apply for grant option 2. You can just propose that in this grant option. All right, Adrian, next slide, please. So for grant option 2 is for work-based learning experiences to provide hands-on work experiences for students with disabilities. So the students in this category do not need to meet a specific disability category. So we're looking to serve all students with disabilities and provide work-based learning opportunities for them. This grant option must provide job exploration and work-based learning as outlined in the scope of work. So you'll notice it includes 2 to 5 hours of individualized job exploration counseling. So we want you to meet with the students prior to providing a work-based learning opportunity to identify what their career interests are, help them navigate and research career pathways, and to have an idea before you set up the work-based learning component. Applicants in this option 2 will look for green colored materials when applying. Then once they complete the job exploration counseling phase, we would want you to set up a work-based learning experience. They must be paid experiences by the employer. They need to be 4 to 10 weeks in length, not to exceed 3 calendar months. The students must work 6 to 20 hours per week. They can include workplace readiness training if the student needs this. So Adri mentioned workplace readiness, earlier. So if a student needs some assistance on the job site with soft skills instruction or any of the soft skills, how to clock in, how to appropriately dress for work, things like that, you can provide that and propose to provide that as part of this grant option. But we want the employer to provide the hands-on training. So we want the employer to train them on the essential functions of their work experience. And you can come in and supplement with that soft skill instruction. And then the grantee must receive employer feedback. So we want you as the grantee to communicate with the employer and track the student's progress and get updates from the employer. Staff providing services must have an active ACRE certification. And we can help you with links to get that if you do not have that already. All right, AG, next slide. I'm going to pause here in case there are any questions between grant 1 and grant 2. I'm seeing, there's a question that says, are these the same requirements for work-based learning under grant option 1? With grant option 1, if it's going to be a work experience, we would want them to follow the same process, but you could propose in grant option 1 to provide other work-based learning options such as job shadowing and things like that. But if they're going to do a hands-on work experience, you want them to follow the same procedures as grant option 1 or 2, sorry.
Amy, she added to her question to say, will our staff need to meet ACRE?
Yes, if they are providing work-based learning opportunities, we would want them to meet ACRE or an equivalent. So we can work with you. If you have another certification that's an equivalent, we would work with you on that as well. Good question, thank you. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. So for grant 2, oh yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you again. So Michelle asked, if we are unfamiliar with that, how do we learn about the certification?
We will post that link in our Q&A page, and that way you can reference it at a later date. There is a website we can direct you to for in-state training, but we will post some links on our Q&A page, and that way we'll all have it for a later reference. You're welcome. All right, so grantee responsibilities. So the first one is to ensure students meet the definition of a student with a disability prior to serving them and gather their disability documentation. So Adri walked us through what the definition of a student with a disability is, and let you know that we need to also confirm that they have a disability through disability documentation. So you'll need to do that before you start serving them. This will involve releases of information. So you will need to follow FERPA and make sure that you are getting consent to collect that information and also share that with BWS. So just be prepared that you will need to most likely either work really well with your educator to get that, or directly contact the families if the client is a minor and is not able to sign for themselves. So, all right, AJ, next slide, please.
Amy, it sounds like somebody's saying that your audio isn't clear and they're struggling to hear you. So I wonder if you have your laptop closed, if you can just open it. That might be better.
Okay, is this better, everyone?
Yeah, that's
Much better. Okay, great. Okay, and then Adri, next slide, please. All right, so the second responsibility would be gaining approval from USOR prior to starting services for each student. So we need to formally approve every student before you start serving them. And why is that? We have to make sure that we are cross-checking against certain things. So, because as I said earlier, we are reporting these students to our federal oversight agency, and we need to make sure that we're not duplicating services. You may potentially identify an eligible client who already has a VR counselor that you want to work with, and that's okay. We just have to make sure that the VR counselor is amenable to them starting services. Maybe they're anticipating providing a similar service, so we don't want to duplicate that way. And then our VR counselor would need to put the service into their plan. The student may have been determined ineligible for VR, and in that case, they wouldn't be eligible to participate in the contract service with you. So we would let you know that before you got started. They may be already participating with another contractor, and we do have situations where the student participates with 2 different contracts, but that wouldn't happen at the same time. So we may identify that you need to wait to start services, or it maybe doesn't make sense to go forth with services. And then we always want to look at what's appropriate and necessary for that student. So we do try to have a really quick turnaround time with approvals. So usually that goes through Adri, but if she's unavailable, I can be a backup. So we try not to make the student or you wait too long, but just know that you do have to screen everybody through us first. And then if you see that point in red, it just says VR counselors may refer students to the contract. So you may have a VR counselor reach out to you and wanting to send their student your way, and that's okay too. And that does happen with our current contracts.
Amy, we have a question. Do all students need to connect with VR?
Well, that's a great question. All students do not need to connect with VR, but you as a contractor, we want you to be able to refer them to VR if they need our services. So that they know that we're available later. So your contracts would provide a light touch to our students, but if they need the full services, I always call them like the light app and the full app, like on your phone. But if they need the full app, we'd want them to come to VR. So you can be an ambassador for us to give them information about VR, or if you're noticing that they need something that you can't provide as a contract provider. So, but they don't all have to come to VR. And some of them won't need to. They might get what they need from you and move on and be successful later. But we want them to know about us in case they do need us. Good question. All right, EG, next slide, please. So our third responsibility is, as we said earlier, collecting all the data points and entering them into the AWARE case management system. So you as a contractor would be given guest access to our AWARE case management system. You will only be able to see your own client base, but we will be having you enter students' data in there, and then within 5 business days, and then uploading their disability documentation there. And that really helps us with our federal reporting because we do provide our federal oversight agency with quarterly reports for each of the students. And Adri's going to walk you through a little bit later what those screens look like. It's not too intense of a data entry component, but what we've learned from our current contracts is if you have someone that's dedicated to do that piece and is comfortable and kind of savvy with technology, that seems to go a little bit smoother in those instances. So just be prepared for it. It doesn't necessarily need to be a full-time FTE on your part, and it probably wouldn't be, but it is good to have someone in mind as you're applying for the contract. You as a contractor, so number 5, you as a contractor will conduct pre and post assessments as well. We have asked our, and we will ask our new providers to create pre and post assessments to identify the student's skill gain. So we will want you to do that and report your data to us. And then develop community partnerships with community partners such as businesses, LEAs, other referral sources. So you will be responsible for marketing and outreach of your program. So I'm going to pause there in case there's any questions. Okay, so Adrian, go ahead on to the next one, please.
We did have a question. So Scott said, are we on our own to figure out assessments? We have to make them and use them as a measure.
Yes, so you would be on your own to create your assessment. And then also we would approve them. So Adrian and I will work with you on fine-tuning your assessment if you get to the contract award phase. But yes, you will measure your own program. And there's lots of ideas on that WinTech website too that I shared with you earlier. So you can use that as a resource if you prefer. And with the pre and post assessments, we have noticed entities that are using a Likert scale to measure skill gain seems to be the most effective. So just keep that in mind too. Okay, and then number 7, recruit students to generate enrollment. So you will be responsible to find your students. Again, we do have counselors who will refer to you and other LEAs, and once you get comfortable with your referral sources, they usually start to refer, but you will be responsible for recruitment. We talked about gaining approval prior to starting with any services. And then also let us know if you plan to make any changes to your program, so, or how your services are implemented. And then 9, cooperate with USOR and institutions of higher education on program evaluations. So we are doing our own internal evaluations of our contracts as well. So just you're responsible to cooperate with us there. And then last but not least, services during COVID-19. As you all probably noticed, we did postpone our RFGA due to COVID-19. The new date, start date would be September 1st. And that's hopefully to allow for more recovery from our pandemic. However, we have made some concessions for our current contracts during COVID-19, and we are allowing for some virtual service delivery during this time. So we would continue to do that if that was needed during the start of the new contracts. But hopefully we're in a better position than we are now. So, all right. Next slide. So on our outcomes and deliverables, again, specific performance indicators will vary based on your details. So you will be creating your own pre and post tests. And the reason for that is you all are serving students a little bit differently. You are going to report and track all your outcomes listed on the scope of work. You're responsible for meeting your outcomes and deliverables in a timely and efficient manner. If you are having difficulty reaching your outcomes, you'll want to reach out to us and let us know and ask us for assistance as soon as possible so we can work with you on that. All right, next slide. Reporting, you must provide us with a quarterly report with the status of your program. And this is listed in the scope of work as well as it will be put into your contract. the number of students served, partnerships built, success stories. So we do want a soft report of where you are every quarter, along with your data entry in our AWARE system. You will be required to update actual services at a minimum of monthly in accordance with federal fiscal reporting. So I listed those dates there. So the actual services is a screen in our AWARE case management system, which just tracks those 5 core Pre-ETS services that Adrienne referenced earlier. So you just want to make sure every month that those are up to date and accurate, so that when we report to our federal oversight agency that we're not making any errors. So in addition to those new students entered within 5 days, this is another requirement that we have for tracking. Okay, Adrienne, next slide. All right, so the method of reporting, you will receive, again, limited access to our AWARE case management system. You will be given 1 user per contract, so we only give access to 1 person per contract. That person will be given a token that they use in order to access the AWARE system. You are not allowed to share those tokens, so it's only 1 person that can access that. It doesn't mean you can't share information with that person internally, but that only that 1 person can access our case management system for security reasons. If you have to report or change a AWARE user, then you'll want to report that ASAP so that we can get that switch done properly. We will provide training prior to your program start, so we do come out and train you on how to use our AWARE system and the data pieces that we need you to enter. So you will receive training on that. And then again, you'll be responsible for entering our students' information timely. All right, I'm going to pause there and make sure before I pass it over to Adri, are there any questions before we move forward? Okay, I think Adri, you're good to move on.
All right, so I'm just going to briefly walk through what our data entry system looks like and kind of what you can expect. Like Amy said, it's not super hard, but it will be time consuming because there are a lot of different data points that we need to gather. There are a lot of different screens that you'll have to navigate through. And so really we can't, I think, impress enough upon you that the best thing to do will be to plan out who has access to the system and who will be the one who is providing these this data entry, because if you don't have somebody who you think will be really savvy at it and will do a great job, we've just seen a lot of struggle with those who don't. It also does take time, so if you're assigning it to somebody who you know, wouldn't have the time to be able to complete this activity in a timely manner, then you might want to think again about that, because this is a very important part of what we're doing. Obviously, serving students is our #1 priority, but being able to report accurately is probably the closest #2. So with that being said, when you enter in a student, this screen that you're seeing right now is the intake screen. And so you will be entering in a last name, first name, gender, birth date, basic demographic information on this screen. We will also be requiring that you enter information about the education. So thinking about the requirements that I went over for what constitutes a student with a disability and the documentation that you have to gather for the student, that's all information that you'll have to enter into AWARE. So on this page, this is the educational goal page. You will have to enter in an educational goal for the student. You'll have to go into this a little bit deeper and tell us whether or not they have an IEP or a 504 or other documentation, what school they're attending, what grade they're in, different information. And then this is, we also do require that you provide us with disability documentation. So this is the screen where you would add the disability documentation. We just need to know that you did have a professional provide you with documentation that that student is indeed a student with a disability. And then this is the screen where you would enter in actual services. So this is where Amy was talking about documenting the services, the 5 Pre-ETS service that you provide to the students. This is where you would enter this information in. You would specify which of the 5 Pre-ETS you were providing, provide a brief description of that, and then give us start and end dates. And this is actually an older screenshot, so there's a couple of data points that are missing on this, but it's just kind of an example to give you an idea of what you're looking for when your data person is entering in data. Okay, so now we are going to, well, actually, before I move on, does anybody have questions about data entry, about our case management system as it relates to providing these services? Okay, so if you have questions, Amy can interrupt me with those questions, but I will just move forward. So we will be doing formal contract monitoring of all of your contracts. That happens at a minimum of once per year. As a part of your application process, you are assigned a risk level, and so it depends on what your risk level is for how often we do a formal monitoring. This formal monitoring includes a fiscal record review, a student file review, and interviews with your staff, students, families, educators, anybody involved with the program to kind of understand what you're doing and how things are going. And then we will be scheduling site visits to observe in person the services that you're delivering to the students and ensure that they are Pre-ETS allowable and compliant. Right now, we're doing those at least quarterly. That may change, just depending on availability, but that's something that you should expect, is that we will come and observe your sites to determine how you're doing. Other monitoring activities can include technical assistance, desk reviews, survey of your participants, and expenditure review. And after we've completed monitoring, you'll be sent findings and expected to resolve those in a timely manner. Any failure to resolve any of the issues that come up may result in repayment of disallowed costs and evaluation of future contracts and renewals. Is there any questions about the monitoring process? Okay. So we are going to briefly talk about data sharing. Amy already kind of went over this a little bit before, but so in order to access our AWARE system, whoever is assigned to do your data entry will have to complete a third-party access form, and then you'll receive a token, the token that Amy talked about. So that token allows for two-factor authentication. So basically, whoever is assigned to AWARE will log in through a secure portal, and they'll use that token to type in a number that's on the token, as well as their username and regular password. There are further data security requirements, which you can read about in the scope of work, or you can submit questions to us and we can review those with you as they come up. And you are required to have full disk encryption. So is there any question about data sharing? I'd say probably the biggest thing is that it's just very important that you know that only the person who's assigned to your token may use it and may access our system. Okay, whoops. So we're going to talk about budgeting and invoicing now. So like Amy said, the contracts right now are, the funding is for a 24-month period with a 1-year option for review, or renewal, sorry. So if you are awarded a contract, we will be reserving the amount of funding that we need to fund your contract for 24 months. And then at the end of your 2nd year, we will review your contract and determine whether or not to renew it. And then any remaining funds from your contract period will be retained by DWS USOR. So the contracts are paid on a fee-for-service basis, or Amy, correct me if I'm using the wrong term, but fee-for-service basis. So as you serve students, you will bill us for the students that you serve. Any money that isn't used in the reserve that we put aside for your contract will come back to us. And then any expenses must be appropriate and included in your hourly rate as outlined in the budget sheet, and I will go over the budget sheet in a little bit. April through June invoices must be submitted to DWS by July 15th. That's the end of the state fiscal year, so it's important that we have those invoices for that period of time in a timely manner. So does anyone have any questions about budgeting and invoicing and how the contracts are funded?
Adri, we can also have, if Stephen, you want to interject anything regarding the state fiscal year end, feel free to add that as well.
I didn't know Stephen was here.
Yeah, it's all good.
Stephen, I would be happy to have you talk through this a lot more.
No, actually, I thought that you were doing a fantastic job, and I thought that I could just let you continue to roll through it. But we say here only expenses authorized in the approved budget will be reimbursed. The expenses that you're putting together in your approved budget are used to come up with your hourly rate, and your hourly rate is what we're going to be paying you based on. But the expenses in your budget that are used to come up with the hourly rate, they must be appropriate for the award. So let's see.
I'm going to interrupt for just a second, Stephen. We have a question in the chat box that says April to June 2020. And Selena, that really, I don't think we meant to put 2020 in that. It just kind of was automatic. So any time that you're serving students that need to be billed for the months of April to June, the invoice has to be received by July 15th. Go ahead, Stephen.
Okay. We have an invoice template that we'll provide that you'll want to use when you're requesting reimbursement. Use that as the invoice. Signature and date, of course, required on these invoices. The level of supporting documentation, it's going to be based on a variety of factors that we'll be working with you individually on and communicating with you exactly what that will entail. And the expense reimbursement requests, generally they need to be monthly unless you request to have it quarterly and get that pre-approved. When you submit the invoice by email, just make sure the subject line contains the contract number, organization name, and the billing month or quarter if it's on a quarterly basis. And just limit it to one invoice per email. So if for whatever reason there's a couple invoices that you want to submit, just send them in 2 separate emails, one each. Let's go to the next slide. So grantees will receive payment for expenditures in the approved budget, kind of like I went over before. It's based on the hourly rate, and the expenses in the approved budget are just used to come up with that hourly rate. And as mentioned kind of in the previous slide already, generally we'll expect you to invoice us on a monthly basis unless the quarterly basis is pre-approved. And along with each invoice, just make sure any supporting documentation that we require and communicate to you in advance is provided. And if there's a lack of compliance with tracking or data entry, then we do have the right to withhold payment until that's resolved. I think that is it as far as invoice reimbursement goes. Are there any questions pertaining to that?
I don't see any in the chat, so if you think of something later, feel free to submit it to myself or Brian, and we can upload that to the Q&A page if you think of something later.
Okay, so who's, I don't know who's covering the budget.
Okay, so Adri's going to talk through the budget sheets next.
Okay. So yes, sorry, I got lost. Yes, applicants can propose rates up to the maximum listed in the scope of work. So we have outlined some maximums in your scope of work. So if you review section 13, you will see what the maximums are there. And then you'll use the budget detail, which I'll run through with you to calculate your budget rate. So all of the expenses that you would need to be able to run your program would have to be included in your rate. Okay, and now I am going to pull this up. So I'm going to go to the actual RFGA page. I'm going to show you the budget sheet and kind of how to navigate the page while I'm there for anybody who is curious. So this is the grants page. Any information that you want to know about the grant is on this page. All eligibility requirements are listed here. This section includes all of the application documents, which Brian will go over a little bit later. Any addendum or changes that we have made are outlined in this tab. And then if you have any questions that you didn't submit during this meeting, you may submit them here through this link until Friday, June 12th. So I'm going to go back to the application and pull up the budget sheet and just kind of show you what it looks like and how to navigate it. So when you open the budget sheet, you will come to this first page. For anybody who is working on this utilizing a screen reader, it is not screen reader friendly. So if you do need us to unlock it for you, please let us know and we will work with you on that. But it's locked down right now, so it doesn't work with a screen reader. So first page, you're reporting who you are, the total amount of funding that you'll need, number of students that you're projecting to serve, and then your projected cost per student. And then we down here have broken that up into year 1 and year 2. So if I just start filling this out for my organization name, and then total cost is $50,000 or maybe $5,000 a year. And then I'm going to serve 15 students. So that'll auto-populate and auto-calculate everything on this page for you. Down at the bottom of the screen, there are 2 additional tabs. That's where you will outline your budgets for year 1 and year 2. So if you come into budget year 1, and year 1 and year 2 both look the same. So something to be aware of, this whole first section is for those who are applying for Grant 1. So if you're applying for the blind and visually impaired and or deaf and hard of hearing grant, you will fill out section 1 for grant option 1. And it's the same kind of information in this spreadsheet. So we want to know how many students you're going to serve. So I'm going to say I'm going to serve 5 students, and it's going to take me 20 hours per student to provide these services. So depending on which services you want to provide, so as you can see, we have all 5 of the Pre-ETS listed here. So you can provide all of them, or you can provide 1 or 2 of them. And then determine what your hourly rate will be, so that then we know what you're doing. So this is, and there are also different sections here for group versus individual services. So your group price is going to be, and if you look at the scope of work, group prices are going to be less because you're serving more students at one time. So if you're thinking of providing group services, then you would detail which of these 5 services you're providing to a group and how much that is going to cost you in this first part here. In this second part, this is where you will detail individualized services. So anything that you are providing one-on-one to the students will be entered in here. You can see that there is a 6th category in this section. In fact, sorry, let me blow this up so that it's easier seen. There's a 6th category in the individual service section. That is for peer mentoring. So if you are going to be providing peer mentoring to students as a part of this, you can categorize that here and outline how much it would cost you to provide peer mentors. And I believe we put a peer mentor rate into the scope of work. And then as you go through, all of this follows exactly what we've listed in the scope of work. So if you're reading the scope of work, everything that we put here follows straight down what we've listed there. You can serve students in rural areas, and we have added There's a rate in the scope of work for providing services to students in rural areas. So you would just have to indicate the number of students that you would plan to serve, and then, or the number of classes that you plan to provide. Because again, if you're providing individual one-on-one services, that number and that rate is going to be different from a group service. Yes.
There is a question in the chat box from Kurt Phillips to clarify. Is there a reason that the 2-year total for average cost per student adds the totals rather than the averages?
No, it's not a reason. We can look at that and see if maybe we did a wrong calculation or if we just used incorrect terms there. But we'll look at that and see, unless Amy has different clarification to give.
I don't. I think we'll just have to take a look at it and then edit the document if it's not working properly, or we can provide clarification later in the Q&A page if needed as well.
Thank you. And thanks for that question, Kurt. So we will be providing a rural services fee, so that's where you can add that. We know that working with the deaf and hard of hearing or the blind and visually impaired will require some auxiliary devices or services. So we have included this section for you to outline for us what services or devices you will need in order to work with your population. And typically the rates and costs on those type of things vary, and this services or devices vary. So we haven't at this time applied a rate to that. You will need to tell us what it will cost for you to be able to provide that. So this section here is for any services, and then this section here is for any devices that you will need to provide. Does anybody have any questions on this portion of the budget before I move down to the next part?
Adri, I just wanted to remind everyone, while you're all thinking of your questions, I just wanted to remind everyone that the fees, the maximum fees are listed in the scope of work in section 13. So you can refer to that to look at the fee structure. And then on the auxiliary devices and services, the only service that we have that has a fee set is for interpreters, and that's $63.25. So just note that as well. But as Adri said, if you needed another type of device or aid, you could put that into your budget sheet.
Thank you for that clarification.
Yes.
I forgot that we put interpreters in there. So if there's not any questions about this portion of the budget, I'll move on to the other portion. So one thing to note about this budget and to note about what we have kind of been talking about so far is that if you're applying for Grant 1, work-based learning can be provided in several different ways. I kind of talked about it when I went over the 5 different services, but work-based learning is not relegated only to an internship or to a short-term job. That's what we want in Grant 2, is for our students to be able to participate in real-world short-term internships. But it's in terms of Grant 1, if there are other options that you would like to utilize with your students, like job shadows or informational interviews or anything like that, you can just complete this first section of the budget and add in your work-based learning time and rate on this part of the budget. However, if you do want to provide work-based learning in the way that it's laid out in Grant 2, we would prefer that you fill in this second part of the budget for your work-based learning piece, even if you are applying for Grant 1. So it might be a little confusing, so just hang on. So for grant option 2, what you're going to do is you are going to, following the scope of work, you're going to tell us how many students you project to serve, how many hours you think it will take to serve that student, and what the rate is. You're going to put in your workplace readiness training hours. So Amy talked about that a little bit as well. And so that would be anytime that you think you might need to have as a job coach on the job with the student, helping them with those soft skills. So that would be, how to interact with the other employees and how to clock in and clock out. We really would, the purpose of work-based learning for this is that we want the employer to be the trainer and to teach the hard skills. But we know that there are some soft skills that need to be taught as well. And so that's where these work-based readiness training hours come in. And then we do have a section here for employer stipends. So this is again another place where our preference would be that the employer pay the student their wage. However, we know that sometimes that just isn't the case, or sometimes it makes things easier to be able to come with a package and say, we will reimburse you $10 an hour, or if you work with the student. And so we have included a section for employer stipends. So you would just need to determine how many students you would need stipends for, how many hours you think the students would need to work. And again, the fee structure is outlined in section 13 of the scope of work. So if you read through that, you'll have an idea of what we would allow for employer stipends. Anytime that you are engaging a student in an internship, we want them to be paid at a rate commensurate with anybody else who would be doing the same job that they are doing. So this will definitely just be an average for you, but just kind of thinking about it in terms of, are there students that you would be able to work with employers to have the employers pay, and are there students who might need to be paid more or paid less?
Adri,
Yes.
another question in the chat box from Brooke Barnhill saying, do you have suggestions for how we calculate the time needed for data entry, managing the grant, and how to fit it into the hourly system?
That's a good question. I'm going to turn it over to Amy to answer that question.
I think it would depend on how many students you're projecting to serve. We do know, Adri walked you through the screens of data collection. It's not terribly time consuming, but if you are serving a lot of students, that's where you might want to consider that component, because you'll have one data entry person. So I think it's just based on the numbers. But we can think on this one a little bit more too, and then add more clarification on the Q&A page.
Okay, and then thank you, Amy. We have another question from Laura. It says, do you also have suggestions for calculating the anticipated employer stipends if we do not yet have established job placements? And really the answer to that is that the reason that we want you to do job exploration counseling with the students is because we really want as much as possible for the internships to be individualized to the student. So we don't expect you to kind of know where your placements would be right now, because you haven't worked with your population yet, with your students yet. And you may have, a pool of students that you're hoping to work with, but we would want that to be individualized to the students. So I would say probably just take an average of how many hours you think your students would work, knowing your population, and then divide that by $10 an hour, or whatever we have listed in the scope of work, because that will kind of get you at least to an average of what you would need. But, you know, trying to make those employer contacts and trying as much as you can to have the employer pay is important as well. So I hope that answered your question, but if you have further questions, please let me know.
I would just add, Adri, that just remember when Stephen was talking about the monies left unencumbered, if you do not use the full amount of your award, we will just keep that, so to speak. So if you do feel like the employers that you already have an idea that you might perform outreach to would need that stipend, you can be a little bit more conservative with the hopes that maybe you wouldn't need to use that too. So because we know that it just varies on the employer's need that way too, but we would just reserve that money if needed, and that would be the best case scenario to have more employers willing to pay the students for their time. So we're hoping for that, but we know that sometimes that's not something that the employer can do. I don't know if that helped, but.
Okay, let's see. Lara said, yes, absolutely. I was concerned about the need to identify placement before knowing best fit. So I appreciate the recognition of this. Yes, thank you, Lara. That was a really good question. Okay, so just finishing up the budget. So when you're doing work-based learning, you'll just enter in number of students, number of hours, how much that would cost you per hour to provide that student. And then this last section is for milestone fees. So we know that there are going to be some costs that come up in association with developing sites and with placing students at sites and just the administration and organization of services. So we've included different milestone rates. These ones we have locked at a flat rate. So for worksite development, worksite development and worksite placement, we will provide a rate of $250 per student. Once the student has completed their internship, we will pay a $100 attainment fee for that per student. If the student is placed in a STEM field, there is a $100 milestone for that. And then another rural fee. So if the student is served in a rural area, we will provide a $250 milestone payment for that. So that is the budget. Like I said, year 2 looks the exact same. You're just adding all of that. So kind of going back to the question that Brooke asked about how to calculate your administrative time, I would suggest just sitting down and determining what's needed to go into your hourly rate. So like Amy said, how many students you think you can serve versus what needs to be put into serving those students, and that's where the hourly rate comes from. And then those things that are allowable and not allowable are included in our scope of work. I can just kind of briefly go over a couple. So transportation is not allowed, and hard skill coaching at this time is not allowed. So those are 2 things that we can't pay for in this grant and can't be included as a part of your budget. Are there any other questions about the budget?
I would just encourage everyone to look at section 13 of the scope of work and submit any questions that you have. Brian's going to talk about some more dates, but submit that before the Q&A closes. We're happy to answer those and upload those for everyone to see on that Q&A page, that link that Adri showed you earlier. So please do that before that date, and then Brian's going to talk about that in a minute. But All these fees are outlined in section 13 of the scope of work.
All right, and on that note, I will turn it over to Brian to go over all of the attachments and other details.
Thanks, Adri. So just as a reminder, the application documents will all be on the grants page, as Adri showed you. All of them are in PDF. So except for the budget, which will be an Excel document. What is important is to, when you click on one of the application appendices, you need to download the document and then save it, as you will be attaching those via email to me when your application is submitted. So just as a reminder, each of those links will download a PDF or Excel document that you save to your desktop, and then you will submit all of those as attachments via email to me, which I will provide my email in just a minute. So this is just a list of all the application and contract attachments and appendices. I will be reviewing 4 of the main attachments that will be in your actual contract, as I am the kind of the intermediary for the program experts, Amy and Adri, helping them with the scoring, awarding, and then executing or finalizing of those contracts for those who will receive a grant. The first attachment that I wanted to review is the grant terms and conditions attachment A. Now, just to remind you, you'll want to be sure to read through all of the terms and conditions and attachments that will be part of your grant. All of these attachments are accessible through the RFGA link on the grants page. You'll want to ensure that you understand all of the requirements, as I will not be going into depth, extreme length of all of these attachments. Hopefully, this is just a quick overview of the most important terms and conditions, and feel free to ask questions in the group chat if you are unsure of something that I'm reviewing. So with that, the first clause that I'm referring to will be the conflict of interest clause, number 3. Really, this is just saying any individuals who have a competing interest or a conflicting loyalty regarding any part of this grant should not be part of this project or program. So when in doubt, if you feel there may be a conflict of interest for any employee, director, etc., connect with us before moving forward. The next term is number 4, related parties. So the awarded grantee may not use these grant funds to make payments to related parties without a written consent from DWS. The grantee is defined as any owner, partner, director, or officer with the authority to establish any policies or make decisions under this grant. And then related parties to one of those is any person who is related to the grantee through blood or marriage, and it includes father, mother, husband, wife, son, daughter, sister, brother, grandfather, grandmother, grandson, granddaughter, uncle, aunt, nephew, niece, first cousin, mother-in-law, father-in-law, brother-in-law, sister-in-law, son-in-law, or daughter-in-law. I add all of that just to give you a clarity that it is important to ensure that there is no related parties involved. If there is a related party that you want to have as part of this grant, there is a pre-approval process and written consent that is required. So at any time of a potential related party conflict, you'll need to connect with Adri and Amy to have a written approval before putting them into this program. The next clause is number 12, grantee assignment and subcontractor. So this is just explaining that your organization as the awardee, grantee, contractor, is responsible for everything in this contract, and that includes anything that you subcontract out. So all parties involved are subject to the requirements of this grant, you and any subcontractors that you work with for this Pre-ETS 2020. The next clause is monitoring, number 14. And this is basically saying your organization will be monitored at least annually, as Adri mentioned, and you will work directly with Adri and Amy for specific details when that comes to be. Evaluation and audit may vary, as they explained earlier, to ensure you have compliance with all the grant requirements. Number 16 is the agreement termination. Basically, efforts will always be to resolve any issues in order to make you guys successful. However, if you're unable to meet compliance or meet requirements, there may be a reason to terminate, and there are multiple reasons for termination in this terms and conditions. Sorry, I'm like, what does the T's and C's stand for? But just understand, we will work with you at all times to ensure that you are successful and want to avoid any termination if at all possible. Number 21 is citing workforce services in the grant program promotion. So you are allowed to state that you are receiving funding from DWS, but you may not state that DWS recommends your program over others, and there is DWS marketing information available to you upon request for your use. Number 30 is records of administration. This just is a reminder that you should retain all records for 6 years after the grant terminates or after all audits are completed, whichever is later. The next to review is number 33, financial reporting and audit requirements. Just asking that you please ensure that your finance person or accounting staff in your organization are familiar with and follow all the requirements within regular state, federal financial reporting laws and regulations. Number 35 is payment withholding. And this is stating that all payments or billing reimbursements can and may be withheld if you are not meeting your program requirements or are in compliance with the contract. So that would be like if you are not submitting your outcome reports timely or quickly resolving your monitoring issues, that your billing reimbursement may be held until you do meet that compliance. Number 39 is financial or cost accounting system. So whoever is doing your accounting, make sure they're following all general standard accounting practices, and that references here in the T's and C's is the generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP. Number 42 is changes in the budget. So any changes to your awarded budget have to be coordinated and pre-approved through Amy and Adri, your contract owners, before you make any changes. So just be aware, if you do want to change something after this contract has been finalized, you will need to coordinate that change with Amy and Adri. That's all I'm going to be reviewing on the terms and conditions. Are there any questions with regards to that attachment? Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next attachment, which is the non-disclosure form. The non-disclosure form is really to ensure privacy.
Brian?
Yes.
Sorry, what's the attachment number on that?
It is attachment C.
Okay, thank you.
So the non-disclosure is to ensure privacy of all clients' information. This form should be completed upon the start of the grant with all of your staff who plan to be a part of the program, and then upon the hire of any new staff or volunteers that are participating in this grant. So the form has to be signed by all staff and volunteers who have access to client personal information, and you need to make sure they understand that information accessed in this grant shall only be used for direct purposes only. Also, this form is to be kept on file and stored in a secured location, and it will be verified at monitoring annually. But it only has to be done for one person once within the grant period. The next is attachment D, which is the code of conduct. So this is a form to ensure the protection of all the clients from any abuse, neglect, maltreatment, or exploitation. So please make sure to review this document with your staff before you have them sign it. And this again is for all staff or volunteers who have interaction with clients. The form is signed and held in a secure location. Again, similar to the non-disclosure upon the grant start date or upon their hire and beginning of their participation in the program. And then the final attachment that I wanted to review is attachment E, which is the BCI or criminal background check requirements. So the background check is required for all staff and volunteers acting as part of or being paid out by this contract. So that's any of those who have access to DWS customer confidential information. And it's important to note that this is not required for projects like equipment purchases, but this program in particular would require a background check. So in addition to the regular background check, any staff or volunteers working with minors or vulnerable adults, any disabled person is under the definition of a vulnerable adult, will also require fingerprint-based national criminal history record check, which provides direct services for those who provide direct services or have direct access to these individuals. So for future reference, this can be added to your budget proposal in the application to pay for this. I know that there is a cost to this. You can put that cost in your budget request to pay for all of your BCI that is required in this grant. This is typically reviewed in the monitoring of the contract to ensure that all staff have a BCI. So please ensure that these records are held in a secure location with your code of conduct and non-disclosure agreements. If there are any issues that come up with a background check, you are required to report it by notifying Amy and Adri as your contract owner in order to determine next steps and what to do. But ultimately, if someone comes back with specific background check issues, you will need to remove them from this grant. Are there any questions in regards to any of the attachments that I've reviewed? And again, if you do run into any questions, feel free to connect with me and Amy to verify that. It looks like there's a question. Just to clarify, if staff or volunteers do not have fingerprinting, they must get that done prior. So yes, anyone who, there's two things to this. Anyone who is to be part of this program needs to have the background check and fingerprint received before they get onto this grant. There is a caveat to that, but we don't encourage it. And that is if, say, the supervisor has their background check back and they're cleared to go, and they are supervising that employee or volunteer during their entire time that they're working on the program with students, that is an allowable exception, but it should be temporary and should be a very specific exception to the rule. You should have all of your employers and volunteers cleared in the background check and fingerprinting before they start in the program. And if there are any discrepancies or questions, just to connect with me and Amy to ensure that we're all on the same page. Good question, though. Okay, so if we can go back to the PowerPoint, we'll just be finishing up with a few reminders.
Okay, go ahead. I'm having trouble getting it to display on this page.
No problem.
So we'll just use it this way.
For the award notices, we hope to be notifying those who we are wanting to award in August. So that will be only a few weeks before the start of this grant, but we will be doing that as quickly as possible to notify those who applied whether they received an offer or not. The start date is September 1st, as originally mentioned, or upon the final execution of the signed contract or grant agreement. Next slide, please. So in the RFGA link on the grants page, there is a submission checklist. There are a few things we are just wanting to remind you. There are a few things that have due dates that are required. So the first is the letter of intent. There is a link on the grants webpage to complete this. It's very informal. It just has basic contact information and a statement that you are intending to apply. Now, it is required to submit the letter of intent, but just because you submit it does not mean that you have to apply. The next is all of the application forms that are Appendix A through D, and then there's a link to the grants webpage. They are all, and we'll give you the final application due date in just a second. With that, a reminder that you will email PDF and the budget Excel in an application attachments to my email, which is bpretty@utah.gov. And then there are additional attachments that are required to give us for your application. That it would be the business letter or your 501c3 nonprofit letter, 2 collaboration letters, and the pre and post assessments that were previously mentioned in this presentation. Next slide. In addition to that, you are required to have general liability insurance, and that requires a $1 million per occurrence, $3 million aggregate coverage, and that it states DWS is endorsed as an additional insured. There is information about the insurance in the RFGA, and you would simply work with your insurance provider to ensure that you're fulfilling the insurance coverage needed for this grant. There's a question on the chat that says, what types of collaborations are you anticipating? Amy, would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, we want to have letters of collaboration with different community partners that you would potentially partner with for your grant. So they could be LEA partners, unemployer partners, those kind of collaborations that would be appropriate for your proposal.
Okay. In addition to insurance, after we submit the intent to award, we will be offering requesting you to complete a pre-award risk assessment. Don't worry about that until we get to the point where you are offered an award for this grant. We will at that time send you forms and work with you to complete those. You are also required upon the award to attend a grant orientation webinar. That is a mandatory attendance, and that will be held August 18th from 10 a.m. to 12 noon. It looks like there are a few questions again.
No, I answered it in the chat. Keep going. So the question was, would national partners be approved? And so if the national partner collaborations are okay.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah.
Next slide, please. This is your final reminder. The application due date, well, the letter of intent first, that is the first due date, which is Thursday, May 28th. So make sure to submit your contact information saying that you are intending to apply. And then the application deadline, sending me emails with all the attachments, is due Friday, June 12th by 12 p.m. So in that, please try to submit that earlier than 11:59, because I will be required to look at the date stamp of my email receipt in order to consider whether the application was received timely or not. And we do not give exceptions to late submitting of the application. So if you sent it at 12:57 and there was some weird glitch getting to me and the email date stamp did not say, it said 12:01, it is therefore a denied application. So just encouraging you to not wait to the very last minute, if at all possible, to submit the email. There is no hard copy applications required for this grant. Next slide. Really, this is just your contact information for Amy Langoni and myself, Brian Prettyman. If you have any additional questions, we are allowing questions for this grant through June 1st. So any questions that are given to us will all be shared on the Q&A on the grant webpage. So please be sure to check back on June 2nd to ensure that you receive all the information and answers on the Q&A page on the grants page. Once June 1st passes, we will not be answering direct questions for this grant period. So please be sure that you're familiar with the grant and have reviewed the grant's webpage, RFGA, and all other documents in time to submit any questions before that June 1st deadline. This is really the part where we offer you a last chance to ask any questions. Go ahead and move to the next slide, which is our contact information for both Amy as the program contract owner and me as the contract analyst. Are there any last minute questions in regards to the presentation? And in addition to that, I just wanted to remind you that all of the information we have shared today and all the resources provided are available on the grants page, and that we will be posting this recording. Hopefully it will be posted by early next week. Amy, it looks like there's a question on curriculum.
Oh, so the question is there any advice on curriculum? Are there things you'd like to see, prefer, etc.? I think it would depend on your service delivery and your target outcomes. We do know the peer mentoring component has been very successful with our current contracts. And then self-advocacy building and work-based learning are things that we would hope that our contracts would focus on as well. I know financial literacy is something that we all are also striving to improve for our students with disabilities. don't know if that, hopefully that helps, Scott.
Great. Well, I will pass it over to you, Amy. Thanks so much.
Sure. I wanted to thank everyone for your attendance today. I know sometimes a virtual format is not ideal, especially for this length of a meeting, so I appreciate you hanging in there with us to the very end. We're really excited about our new RFGA and our new contracts, so we really appreciate your interest. We will post your questions on that Q&A page too, and we will expand on them as we are rethinking the questions that you asked today. So thank you for those as well. Again, Brian mentioned you can submit questions up through June 1st. So if you think of something later or have an epiphany, feel free to reach out to myself or Brian, and we will get your questions answered and those posted as well on that Q&A page. But again, we do appreciate you, and thanks for your interest in our RFGA. If you did not put your name in the chat box, please do so that we can keep record of attendance as well. It looks like most of you did, but in case you didn't, just a final reminder on that. And that concludes our meeting. Thanks, and have a great rest of your day.